What if everything you believed about the impossible was wrong? What if miracles weren't just stories from ancient books, but could happen right here, right now, in front of dozens of witnesses with their cameras rolling? This is the story of Michael Collins, a billionaire who thought his money could buy anything, until the day his 12-year-old son Nathan was confined to a wheelchair forever. 3 years of the world's best doctors, millions spent on experimental treatments, and still nothing. Until a mysterious 8-year-old girl walked into the most expensive restaurant in the city, looked directly into Michael's eyes, and made an offer that defied every law of medicine and logic. "Give me food and I will heal your son." The entire restaurant laughed. The billionaire's business partners rolled their eyes. But what happened next would be captured on dozens of phones, witnessed by some of the most powerful people in the city, and change everything they thought they knew about what's possible in this world. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't fiction. This is what happens when faith meets desperation, when the impossible becomes undeniable, and when a simple act of kindness unleashes forces that no amount of money can buy. You're about to witness something that will challenge everything you believe about miracles, healing, and the power of innocent faith. But I have to warn you, once you see what happened in that restaurant, you'll never look at the world the same way again. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of the Collins mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. But inside 12-year-old Nathan's bedroom, darkness seemed to linger no matter how bright the day became. The boy sat motionless in his wheelchair, staring out at the sprawling gardens he could never run through. His thin fingers traced patterns on the armrest, a habit he'd developed over the years of confinement. The silence was broken only by the software of medical equipment that had become the soundtrack of his young life. Michael Collins stood in the doorway, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his success evident in every detail of his appearance. Yet as he watched his son, the billionaire felt smaller than he ever had in any boardroom. 3 years had passed since the accident that changed everything. 3 years of the world's best doctors, the most advanced treatments, experimental procedures that cost more than most people's homes. Nothing worked. The boy who once filled these halls with laughter now spent his days in quiet resignation. "Good morning, buddy," Michael said, forcing brightness into his voice as he entered the room. Nathan turned slightly, offering a weak smile that broke his father's heart every single time. The resemblance between them was striking, the same dark blonde hair, the same intelligent eyes. But where Michael's gaze held power and determination, Nathan's held only a weary acceptance that no child should ever know. The contrast was devastating, a daily reminder of everything money couldn't buy. Nathan's physical therapist had left an hour earlier, shaking her head with the same expression they all wore. Polite professionalism masking deep concern. The boy's legs had grown thinner, weaker, despite every effort to maintain muscle tone. His spine curved slightly from months of sitting, and his once bright complexion had taken on the pale quality of someone who spent too much time indoors. Yet his spirit, though dimmed, still flickered with the curiosity and gentleness that made him special. The medical charts on Nathan's desk told a story of progressive decline that no amount of wealth could rewrite. Spinal cord injury, they said. Permanent paralysis from the waist down. The words had lost their sting through repetition, but their meaning remained devastating. Michael had memorized every term, every prognosis, every slim possibility that the experts dangled like cruel carrots. He'd built an empire on turning impossibilities into realities, but his son's condition remained stubbornly beyond his reach. "Dad, you don't have to look so sad," Nathan said softly, his voice carrying wisdom that belonged to someone decades older. "I'm okay, really." But Michael could see through the brave facade. He noticed how Nathan's hands sometimes trembled with frustration when he dropped something. How the boy's eyes followed other children playing outside with a longing that cut deeper than any business loss ever could. The wheelchair wasn't just confining Nathan's body, it was slowly stealing his hope. The Collins family had once been known for their weekend adventures, skiing in Aspen, hiking in Colorado, sailing off the coast of Maine. Now their weekends consisted of doctor appointments and quiet activities that wouldn't remind Nathan of what he'd lost. The boy's bedroom had been converted into a medical facility disguised as a child's room. Mobility equipment hid behind colorful curtains, and exercise machines masqueraded as toys. Every detail designed to maintain normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Michael's wife had left 2 years ago, unable to handle the stress and grief of watching their son fade away. She'd said she needed space to heal, but Michael knew the truth. She blamed him for the accident. He'd been driving that day, distracted by an important business call when the truck ran the red light. The guilt ate at him daily, manifesting in sleepless nights, and an obsessive drive to find a cure that logic told him didn't exist. Friends and business associates had stopped asking about Nathan's progress. The polite inquiries had dried up as it became clear that this wasn't a temporary setback but a permanent new reality. The boy had become isolated not just physically, but socially. Former playmates had moved on to activities he couldn't participate in. Birthday party invitations had stopped coming. Nathan pretended not to notice, but Michael saw how his son's face fell when the mailbox contained only bills and business correspondence. The irony wasn't lost on Michael that his wealth, which could solve almost any problem, felt meaningless in the face of his son's condition. He donated millions to spinal cord research, funded entire wings of hospitals, brought in specialists from around the world. Each failure felt like a personal indictment of his inability to protect the one person who mattered most. The empire he'd built seemed hollow when he couldn't buy his son's health back. Nathan shifted in his wheelchair, reaching for a book on his nightstand. The simple movement required careful calculation and effort that healthy children took for granted. Michael moved to help, but Nathan waved him off with a gentle smile. "I've got it, Dad." The independence was admirable and heartbreaking in equal measure. This brave little boy, facing each day with courage that humbled grown men, deserved so much more than the hand fate had dealt him. As Michael prepared to leave for another day of business meetings and acquisition deals, he felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders. Success in every area of his life except the one that truly mattered. Nathan called out as he reached the door. "Dad? Maybe today will be different." The hope in his son's voice was both inspiring and devastating, because Michael had stopped believing in miracles long ago. The Golden Oak restaurant sat like a crown jewel in the heart of downtown, its crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables where million-dollar deals were sealed over champagne and caviar. Michael had chosen this place deliberately. A business lunch with potential investors required the right atmosphere of wealth and success. The maitre d' recognized him instantly, guiding him and Nathan to their usual private corner table where they could conduct business without interruption. The soft murmur of conversations mixed with the gentle clink of expensive silverware against fine china. Nathan's wheelchair navigated the plush carpet with practiced ease, though Michael noticed how the other diners' eyes followed them with mixtures of curiosity and pity. His son had grown accustomed to the stares, but Michael still felt protective anger rise in his chest every time. Today's lunch was meant to be special, a chance for Nathan to see his father in action, to understand the empire that would one day be his. The irony wasn't lost on Michael that he was preparing his son for a future the boy might never have the health to enjoy. The investors arrived precisely on time, their handmade shoes clicking against marble as they approached. These were serious men with serious money, the kind who could make or break ventures with a single phone call. Michael stood to greet them, his practiced smile hiding the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. Nathan watched quietly from his wheelchair, his intelligent eyes taking in every detail of the negotiation dance about to begin. The boy had always been fascinated by his father's business dealings, asking insightful questions that surprised even seasoned executives. As they settled into their seats, reviewing portfolios worth more than small countries' GDP, a commotion near the restaurant's entrance caught their attention. The heavy oak doors opened with a soft whoosh, and conversations gradually died as every head turned toward the unexpected visitor. A small figure stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the doorway. At first glance, she appeared to be nothing more than a lost child who had wandered into the wrong establishment. But something about her presence commanded attention in a way that defied logic. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her dark skin glowing with an inner light that seemed to illuminate the entire entrance. Her hair was woven into neat braids that caught the light as she moved, creating an almost ethereal effect. The simple light blue dress she wore was clearly well loved, its fabric soft from many washings, and her modest sandals had seen better days. Yet despite her humble appearance, she carried herself with a dignity that made the restaurant's opulent surroundings seem suddenly artificial and cold. Every eye in the establishment followed her as she stood perfectly still, scanning the room with an intensity that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their seats. The maitre d' approached with obvious confusion, unsure how to handle this unprecedented breach of the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere. Whispers began to ripple through the dining room like ripples on a pond. Who was this child? How had she gotten past security? What was someone so clearly out of place doing in a restaurant where the wine list cost more than most people's monthly salaries? Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by obvious fascination. "Dad, look at her," he whispered, his voice carrying a note Michael hadn't heard in months, genuine curiosity mixed with something that almost sounded like recognition. The girl's presence seemed to fill the entire space, though she stood no taller than the bottom of the chandeliers. Her eyes moved methodically across the room, as if she was searching for something specific among the sea of expensive suits and designer dresses. Michael's business associates shifted uncomfortably, clearly annoyed by this interruption to their carefully scheduled meeting. "Perhaps we should move to a private dining room," one suggested, his tone dripping with disdain. This establishment used to have better security. But Michael found himself unable to look away from the child. There was something about her that defied easy categorization, a presence that seemed ancient despite her obvious youth, a confidence that belonged to someone who had seen far more of the world than her age should allow. The restaurant staff congregated near the entrance, whispering among themselves about how to handle the situation. The child clearly didn't belong in their establishment, yet something about her demeanor suggested she had every right to be there. Her gaze continued to sweep the room, patient and methodical, as if time itself bent to her will. The usual sounds of fine dining, conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, had been replaced by an expectant hush that made everyone acutely aware of their own breathing. Nathan's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles white with intensity. "She's looking for someone," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's subdued atmosphere. And indeed, the girl's systematic scan of the room suggested purpose rather than random wandering. Her eyes held a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young, as if she carried knowledge that transcended ordinary understanding. The contrast between her humble appearance and her commanding presence created a tension that hung in the air like electricity before a storm. The maitre d' finally gathered enough courage to approach her, his steps hesitant and uncertain. But before he could speak, before he could ask the questions that everyone in the restaurant wanted answered, the girl's searching gaze finally found its target. Her eyes locked onto their table with laser-like precision, and Michael felt his breath catch in his throat. Those eyes, deep, knowing, filled with a certainty that defied explanation, were focused directly on him. The businessman at his table fell silent, following her gaze to understand what had captured such intense attention. Time seemed suspended as the girl began to walk toward their table, her bare feet silent against the restaurant's expensive flooring. Every step was deliberate, purposeful, as if she was following a path only she could see. The other diners watched in fascination and growing unease as this mysterious child approached the table where one of the city's most powerful men sat with his disabled son. None of them could have predicted what was about to happen, what words were about to be spoken that would change everything they thought they knew about the world. The child's approach seemed to happen in slow motion, each step echoing through the hushed restaurant like drops of water in a silent cathedral. Michael felt his heart pounding against his ribcage as those ancient eyes remained locked on his, never wavering, never blinking. The businessmen at his table exchanged confused glances, their million-dollar deal temporarily forgotten in the face of this unprecedented interruption. Nathan sat transfixed, his usual shyness replaced by an intensity that matched the approaching girl's unwavering focus. The entire restaurant held its collective breath, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. When the girl finally reached their table, she stopped exactly 3 feet away, close enough that Michael could see the threads of gold woven through her dark brown eyes. Her presence seemed to expand beyond her physical form, filling the space around their table with an energy that made the expensive crystal glasses tremble slightly on their stems. She stood perfectly still for a moment that stretched into eternity, her gaze moving between Michael and Nathan with a knowing expression that suggested she understood far more about their situation than any stranger should. The silence was deafening, broken only by the barely audible hum of the restaurant's air conditioning. The girl's lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that cut through the restaurant's atmosphere like a bell ringing through morning mist. "Give me food and I will heal your son." The words hung in the air, simple and direct, yet loaded with implications that sent shockwaves through everyone who heard them. Her tone held no pleading, no desperation, just a calm statement of fact delivered with the confidence of someone making a business proposal. But this was no ordinary proposition, and everyone in earshot felt the weight of something unprecedented taking place before their eyes. Michael's face went through a series of rapid transformations, surprise, confusion, and then a flush of anger that colored his cheeks red. The audacity of this child, this obvious street vagrant, making such a ridiculous claim in front of his business associates was beyond comprehension. His carefully constructed morning was crumbling into chaos, his professional reputation potentially compromised by this bizarre interruption. The investors at his table looked between him and the girl with expressions that ranged from amusement to concern, clearly wondering how he would handle this delicate situation. Nathan, however, remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the girl with an expression Michael had never seen before. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Michael asked, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation. But the girl simply repeated her statement with the same unwavering confidence, as if she was reading from a script written in stone. "Give me food and I will heal your son." The repetition somehow made the words even more shocking, more impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around the restaurant, conversations had stopped entirely, every patron straining to hear what was transpiring at the billionaire's table. Cell phones appeared discreetly, ready to capture whatever happened next. The girl's certainty was unsettling in its completeness. She didn't fidget or show any signs of nervousness despite being surrounded by wealth and power that should have intimidated any normal child. Her small hands remained clasped in front of her, her posture straight and dignified, her breathing calm and measured. There was no indication that she was making this up or playing some elaborate game. She spoke with the authority of someone delivering a message she knew to be absolutely true, regardless of how impossible it might sound to ordinary ears. One of Michael's business associates let out a nervous laugh, the sound sharp and uncomfortable in the heavy silence. "Well, this is certainly unexpected," he muttered, loosening his tie as if the air in the restaurant had suddenly become thick and difficult to breathe. Another investor reached for his water glass with a shaking hand, clearly struggling to process what he was witnessing. These were men accustomed to controlling every variable in their environment, and this child's presence represented chaos they couldn't calculate or predict. Their carefully planned lunch meeting had transformed into something that defied all logical explanation. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his young face alight with an emotion that took Michael a moment to recognize: hope. Pure, undiluted hope that his father hadn't seen in his son's eyes for 3 long years. "Dad," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying more weight than any business contract Michael had ever signed. "What if she means it?" The question hit Michael like a physical blow, because in that moment he realized his son was considering the possibility that this strange girl might actually be able to do what every doctor in the world had declared impossible. The restaurant staff had moved closer, forming a loose circle around the table but maintaining a respectful distance. The maitre d' wrung his hands nervously, clearly torn between his desire to remove this disruptive element and his fear of offending his most valued customer. Waiters stood frozen with trays in their hands, too fascinated by the unfolding drama to continue their duties. Kitchen staff had emerged from the back, drawn by the unusual silence that had replaced the typical dinner conversation. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The girl remained motionless, her offer hanging in the air like a challenge to everything Michael thought he knew about the world. Her eyes held depths that seemed impossibly vast for someone so young, as if she carried lifetimes of experience in her small frame. When she breathed, it seemed to create ripples in the air around her, subtle disturbances that made the restaurant's expensive artwork appear to shimmer slightly on the walls. The longer she stood there, the more the normal rules of reality seemed to bend in her presence. Michael felt the familiar weight of desperation pressing against his chest, the same feeling that had driven him to spend millions on experimental treatments and miracle cures that had all ended in disappointment. But this was different. This wasn't a doctor in a white coat, making cautious promises hedged with disclaimers. This was a child making an impossible claim with absolute conviction, and something deep in Michael's gut told him that dismissing her would be the biggest mistake of his life. Yet his rational mind rebelled against even considering such foolishness. The girl's patience seemed infinite as she waited for his response, her small body perfectly still while chaos swirled around her. She showed no signs of being intimidated by the wealth and power surrounding her, no indication that she understood how preposterous her offer sounded to adult ears. Her dress fluttered slightly in a breeze that no one else could feel, and for just a moment, Michael could have sworn he saw light emanating from her skin. The impossible was standing 3 feet away from him, offering everything he'd prayed for, and he had no idea how to respond. Michael's laugh erupted from his throat like a bark of disbelief, harsh and sharp enough to make several nearby diners flinch. The sound echoed off the restaurant's marble walls, carrying with it 3 years of accumulated frustration, sleepless nights, and medical disappointments that had slowly eroded his faith in miracles. His business associates shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous edge in their host's voice that appeared whenever someone challenged his authority or intelligence. The girl remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged by his reaction, as if she had expected this exact response and was prepared to wait through whatever storm was about to come. "Are you out of your mind?" Michael's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from surrounding tables where conversations had already ground to a halt. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? What my son has been through?" His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the expensive wood creaking under the pressure. Years of careful emotional control, maintained through countless board meetings and high-stakes negotiations, cracked like ice under the weight of this impossible moment. The absurdity of the situation felt like a personal insult to his intelligence and his suffering. Nathan's soft voice cut through his father's rising anger like a whisper through thunder. "Dad, please." But Michael was beyond hearing, his rational mind reeling from the audacity of this raggedly dressed child who dared to offer hope where the world's leading medical experts had offered only resignation. The billionaire who had built an empire on calculated risks and careful analysis found himself face to face with something that defied every rule he'd learned about how the world worked. His success had come from understanding that everything had a price, everything could be bought or sold, but this child was offering something that couldn't exist in his universe. 3 years. Michael continued, his voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. 3 years of the best doctors money can buy. Specialists who trained at Harvard and Johns Hopkins. Equipment that costs more than most people's houses. And you think you can just walk in here and fix everything with what exactly? His words came out in a rush, each syllable weighted with the desperation he'd been hiding behind expensive suits and confident boardroom presentations. The other diners watched with fascination and growing discomfort as one of the city's most powerful men seemed to unravel before their eyes. The girl's response was a simple nod, as if she completely understood his skepticism and found it perfectly reasonable. "Yes," she said quietly, her young voice carrying an authority that belonged to someone who had never doubted their own capabilities. The single word hung in the air between them, neither defensive nor argumentative, just a calm statement of fact that somehow made Michael's protests sound hollow and desperate. Her certainty was so complete, so unshakable, that it created a strange cognitive dissonance in everyone who witnessed it. How could someone so young speak with such absolute conviction about something so impossible? Michael's business associates exchanged meaningful glances, clearly concerned about their colleague's public display of emotion. One of them cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue this meeting another time," he suggested gently, recognizing that their carefully planned business lunch had transformed into something far beyond their comfort zone. But Michael barely heard him, his attention completely focused on the impossible child, who had somehow managed to crack the armor he'd built around his heart. The restaurant had become a theater, and every patron was now an unwilling audience to his private torment. "You want food?" Michael's voice took on a bitter edge as he gestured around the opulent restaurant. "Look around you. Do you see where we are? This meal costs more than most families spend on groceries in a month. The wine list here could pay for a car. And you think that somehow, magically, feeding you will." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the hope that his son's condition might actually be reversible. Speaking the possibility aloud would make it real, and if this turned out to be just another cruel disappointment, he wasn't sure either of them could survive it. Nathan's wheelchair creaked as he leaned forward, his young face showing a maturity that broke his father's heart daily. What if she's telling the truth, Dad? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 3 years of silent suffering and carefully hidden dreams. Michael saw his own desperate hope reflected in his son's eyes, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about him anymore. Nathan was watching, listening, hoping, and any decision Michael made would either nurture or crush whatever fragile optimism his son had managed to maintain 3 years of medical failures. The girl stepped slightly closer, and Michael caught a faint scent that reminded him inexplicably of spring rain and blooming flowers. Her presence seemed to create a pocket of calm in the restaurant's charged atmosphere, a small island of peace in the storm of his churning emotions. When she looked directly into his eyes, he felt something shift deep in his chest, not quite belief, but perhaps the distant possibility of belief. Her gaze held no judgment for his skepticism, no impatience with his anger, only an infinite well of compassion. That seemed impossible for someone so young to possess. I understand your doubt, the girl said softly, her words carrying a wisdom that belonged to someone who had witnessed countless moments of human desperation and disbelief. But your son believes. Look at him. Michael turned reluctantly toward Nathan, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. His boy's face was radiant with something Michael hadn't seen since before the accident, genuine, uncomplicated joy. Not the brave smile Nathan wore for his benefit, not the careful optimism meant to spare his father's feelings, but real happiness at the possibility that his life might actually change. The weight of the moment pressed down on Michael's shoulders like a physical force. Every eye in the restaurant was on him, every ear strained to hear his response to this impossible offer. His carefully constructed world of logic and control had been invaded by something that belonged in fairy tales, not corporate boardrooms. Yet as he looked at his son's hopeful face, Michael felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. The choice before him was simple yet terrifying: dismiss this child and return to their resigned acceptance of Nathan's condition, or take a leap of faith that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. The girl waited with infinite patience, her small hands folded calmly in front of her as if she had all the time in the world for him to process what she was offering. Her eyes held no urgency, no desperation, just a quiet confidence that suggested she knew exactly how this moment would unfold. The restaurant around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself was waiting to see whether a man who had built his life on certainty could find the courage to believe in the impossible. A ripple of nervous laughter began to spread through the restaurant like wildfire, starting with a suppressed giggle from a woman at the bar and quickly growing into open mockery. Did she just say she could heal him? Someone whispered loudly enough for half the dining room to hear. The sound of adult voices dismissing a child's words with cruel amusement filled the space, creating a chorus of disbelief that seemed to bounce off the crystal chandeliers. Several patrons had their phones out now, openly recording what they clearly viewed as an entertaining spectacle rather than a moment of profound possibility. "Street kids will say anything for a free meal," commented an elderly man in an expensive suit, his voice dripping with disdain. His companion nodded sagely, as if they had solved some complex mystery. Probably coached by professional beggars. They use the disabled to prey on people's emotions. The words cut through the air like knives, each syllable designed to reduce this mysterious encounter to something ordinary and explainable. Their smugness was palpable, the satisfaction of people who believed they understood the world's harsh realities better than anyone else in the room. A woman wearing jewelry worth more than most people's annual salaries leaned toward her lunch companion, her voice carrying clearly across the restaurant. "The poor child is obviously delusional. Someone should call social services. Her tone mixed pity with disgust, as if the girl's presence somehow contaminated the restaurant's carefully maintained atmosphere of exclusivity. Other diners nodded in agreement, their faces showing the particular expression wealthy people wore when confronted with poverty they couldn't understand or control. The general consensus seemed to be that this was an unfortunate intrusion that needed to be handled quickly and efficiently. But through it all, the girl remained absolutely motionless, her expression unchanged by the waves of mockery washing over her. She stood like a lighthouse in a storm, unshaken by the chaos surrounding her small form. Her eyes never left Michael's face, never showed even a flicker of doubt or hurt at the cruel words being spoken about her. It was as if the scorn and disbelief were happening to someone else entirely, in some distant place that couldn't touch her certainty. Her breathing remained calm and measured, her posture straight and dignified, despite being the target of ridicule from every corner of the room. Michael's business associates were growing visibly uncomfortable with the spectacle unfolding at their table. One of them, a man who had made his fortune in pharmaceutical investments, leaned forward with a patronizing smile. "Michael, surely you're not considering this nonsense? The child is clearly disturbed or desperate. Either way, she needs professional help, not encouragement." His words were meant to be reasonable, the voice of sanity in an increasingly surreal situation. But Michael noticed how the man's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, as if some part of him wasn't quite as certain as his words suggested. The maitre d' finally gathered enough courage to approach their table, his face flushed with embarrassment at this breach of his establishment's carefully maintained order. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry about this disruption. Security is on their way to escort the young lady out. We'll, of course, comp your entire meal as an apology for this unacceptable intrusion." His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations, but there was an underlying nervousness that suggested this particular problem was unlike anything in his experience. Nathan's wheelchair creaked as he shifted position, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. "What if everyone's wrong?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge to the room's collective skepticism. His innocent words somehow carried more weight than all the sophisticated arguments being made by the adults around him. Several conversations faltered as people turned to look at this child who dared to suggest that their worldly cynicism might be misplaced. In Nathan's eyes, hope battled with fear, creating an expression that was heartbreaking in its vulnerability. The girl finally spoke again, her voice somehow reaching every corner of the restaurant. Despite its soft tone, "I am not asking you to believe. I am asking you to choose." The words were simple but profound, cutting through all the intellectual arguments and sophisticated dismissals to the heart of the matter. She wasn't trying to convince anyone or prove anything to the skeptical audience. She was offering Michael a choice between the safe certainty of his current despair and the terrifying possibility of hope. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and several people in the restaurant felt something shift in their understanding of what was happening. A young waiter, barely out of college, had been watching the scene unfold with growing fascination. Unlike the older, wealthier patrons, he seemed less certain about dismissing the girl's claims. "What if she's right?" he whispered to another server, his voice barely audible, but carrying genuine wonder. "What if there are things we don't understand?" His question sparked quiet conversations among the restaurant staff, creating a division between those who laughed at the impossibility and those who found themselves wondering if they were witnessing something extraordinary. The girl's persistence in the face of such overwhelming mockery was beginning to have an effect on some observers. A middle-aged woman who had initially laughed at the girl's words found herself studying the child more carefully, noticing details that others had missed. The way light seemed to gather around her small form. The absolute stillness of her breathing. The fact that despite standing on marble floors in simple sandals, she showed no signs of discomfort or fatigue. Slowly, quietly, a few people in the restaurant began to wonder if they were too quick to dismiss something they didn't understand. Michael felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, waiting to see how one of the city's most powerful men would handle this unprecedented situation. His reputation, his business relationships, his carefully constructed image of rational authority, all of it hung in the balance of this moment. The safe choice was obvious: dismiss the child, return to their business lunch, and pretend this bizarre interruption had never happened. But as he looked at Nathan's hopeful face and the girl's unwavering certainty, Michael realized that the safe choice might also be the greatest mistake of his life. The restaurant's atmosphere had become electric with tension, as if the air itself was charged with possibility. Some patrons were already reaching for their coats, uncomfortable with the strange energy that seemed to emanate from the small girl. Others leaned forward in their chairs, unable to look away from what might be the most extraordinary thing they would ever witness. The divide between skeptics and believers was becoming more pronounced with each passing moment, creating an almost palpable tension that made everyone acutely aware they were part of something unprecedented and potentially life-changing. Michael's internal struggle played out across his face like scenes from a silent movie, each emotion distinct and powerful in its turn. The businessman in him screamed that this was madness, a public relations disaster that could damage his reputation for years to come. But the father in him, the part that had spent 3 years watching his son fade away, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the miracle he'd stopped believing in. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, the crystal surface reflecting the restaurant's chandeliers like captured stars. The choice before him felt larger than life, as if the entire universe was holding its breath waiting for his decision. The girl remained perfectly still during his internal debate, her presence somehow making the opulent restaurant feel small and insignificant. Her eyes held no impatience, no desperation, just infinite compassion for a father's struggle between logic and hope. She understood that this decision would define not just the next few minutes, but possibly the rest of Michael and Nathan's lives together. The weight of that understanding seemed to flow from her like warmth from a fire, touching everyone within her immediate vicinity. Even the most cynical observers found themselves leaning forward, caught up in the magnitude of the moment. "This is insane," Michael whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. But even as he spoke the words, he was gesturing to the nearest waiter with a slight nod of his head. The young server approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain about his role in this unprecedented situation. His hand shook slightly as he pulled out his notepad, as if he was about to take the most important order of his career. The surrounding conversations had died to absolute silence, every person in the restaurant straining to hear what would happen next. Cell phone cameras captured every second, preserving this moment for posterity. "What would you like to eat?" Michael asked the girl, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere. The question felt surreal leaving his lips, as if he was speaking lines from a dream he couldn't quite remember. His business associates stared at him in open shock, their carefully composed professional facades cracking under the weight of disbelief. One of them started to protest, but Michael silenced him with a sharp look that had ended more than one corporate negotiation. This was his decision to make, his leap of faith to take or refuse. The girl's first smile since entering the restaurant transformed her entire face, lighting up features that had remained solemnly composed throughout the ordeal of mockery and disbelief. "Anything," she said simply, her voice carrying gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the gesture being offered. Whatever you think is best. Her humility was striking, especially after the confident authority with which she had made her impossible claim. She wasn't asking for the most expensive item on the menu or trying to take advantage of Michael's wealth. She simply wanted food, as if the act of eating itself was more important than what was being consumed. The waiter looked between Michael and the girl with obvious confusion, clearly out of his depth in this situation. Perhaps the chef's special, he suggested uncertainly. It's a pan-seared salmon with seasonal vegetables and... But the girl nodded before he could finish the description, her acceptance immediate and gracious. There was something almost ritualistic about the moment, as if they were participating in a ceremony whose rules they didn't fully understand but felt compelled to follow. The simple act of ordering food had never felt so laden with significance. Michael's phone buzzed with urgent messages from his assistant, probably alerted by social media posts about the strange scene unfolding at the Golden Oak. He ignored them, his attention completely focused on the girl who had somehow managed to crack open a door he'd thought was permanently sealed. Nathan watched everything with wide eyes, his young face glowing with an excitement Michael hadn't seen in years. The boy's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests with white-knuckled intensity, as if he was afraid that moving might somehow break the spell being woven around their table. As they waited for the food to arrive, the girl took a seat in the empty chair beside Nathan's wheelchair, her movements graceful and deliberate. The two children looked at each other with instant understanding, as if they shared some secret knowledge that adults couldn't access. Nathan's usual shyness evaporated in her presence, replaced by an animated curiosity that reminded Michael of the boy his son had been before the accident. Their quiet conversation was too soft for the adults to hear, but their body language spoke of connection and mutual recognition that transcended ordinary friendship. The restaurant staff moved with unusual efficiency, as if they sensed the importance of this particular meal. The chef himself emerged from the kitchen to personally oversee the preparation, his usual professional demeanor replaced by something approaching reverence. Word had spread through the service staff about the strange little girl and her impossible claim, creating an atmosphere of expectation that affected everyone involved in bringing her food to the table. Even the dishwashers found excuses to peer through the kitchen doors, wanting to witness whatever was about to unfold. Michael found himself studying the girl with forensic intensity, looking for any sign of deception or mental illness that might explain her extraordinary behavior. But everything about her seemed perfectly normal except for the impossible thing she had claimed she could do. Her conversation with Nathan was age-appropriate, her mannerisms typical of any 8-year-old child. Yet there was something indefinable about her presence that made the ordinary world seem suddenly full of possibilities he'd never considered. She existed in the space between normal and miraculous, challenging everything he thought he knew about reality. The food arrived on fine china, beautifully plated and aromatic enough to draw appreciative murmurs from nearby tables. The girl looked at the elegant presentation with wonder, as if she was seeing artistic beauty rather than just a meal. Her appreciation was genuine and unguarded, the reaction of someone who truly understood the gift she was being given. She closed her eyes for a moment, and several witnesses later swore they saw her lips move in what might have been prayer or gratitude. The simple act of blessing food had never seemed so profound or meaningful. As the girl took her first bite, the entire restaurant fell into absolute silence. Every conversation stopped, every clink of silverware ceased, every breath was held in anticipation of what might happen next. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the universe itself was pausing to observe this intersection of faith and reality. Michael felt his heart pounding so Hard, he was certain everyone could hear it, while Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, with an expression of pure hope that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. Whatever happened next would change everything, for better or worse. The girl ate with careful deliberation, each bite consumed with gratitude and mindfulness that transformed the simple act into something approaching ceremony. She seemed completely unaware of the dozens of eyes watching her every movement, focused entirely on the meal and the company of the young boy beside her. As she ate, something in the restaurant's atmosphere began to shift, as if the very air was becoming charged with potential. Even the most skeptical observers found themselves holding their breath, waiting to see if the impossible was about to become reality right before their eyes. The girl finished the last bite of her meal with the same deliberate care she had shown throughout, placing her fork gently on the fine china plate with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the silent restaurant. She dabbed at her lips with the linen napkin, her movements graceful and unhurried despite the weight of expectation pressing down on everyone present. Michael felt his chest tighten with anxiety as he realized the moment of truth had arrived. Either he was about to witness the greatest miracle of his lifetime, or he had just enabled an elaborate delusion in front of the city's most influential people. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and there was no turning back now. The girl pushed back from the table and stood, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of every person in the restaurant. The ambient sounds of a high-end establishment, the gentle hum of conversation, the soft clink of silverware, the whispered consultations between staff, had disappeared entirely. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath in anticipation. She moved with purpose toward Nathan's wheelchair, her bare feet silent against the marble flooring. Each step seemed to carry the weight of destiny, as if she was walking along a path that had been predetermined since the beginning of time. Nathan's eyes grew wide as she approached, his young face a canvas of hope, fear, and desperate longing. His hands trembled against the armrests of his wheelchair, and Michael could see his son's chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The boy had lived with disappointment for so long that hope had become a luxury he could barely afford. Yet, something in the girl's presence seemed to awaken possibilities he had carefully buried in the deepest corners of his heart. "What's going to happen?" Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the restaurant's supernatural silence. The girl knelt beside his wheelchair, bringing herself to Nathan's eye level with a gesture that was both respectful and intimate. Her movements held the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted their place in the world, despite her obvious poverty and youth. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet authority that had characterized her impossible offer minutes earlier. "Close your eyes," she said softly, her words meant only for Nathan but somehow reaching every corner of the restaurant. "And feel what you've always known was possible." Her small hands reached toward his legs with movements that seemed choreographed by forces beyond human understanding. Michael lurched forward in his chair, every paternal instinct screaming at him to protect his son from whatever was about to happen. But something in the girl's expression stopped him. Cold, a look of such profound compassion and certainty that it momentarily paralyzed his ability to intervene. His rational mind was screaming warnings about charlatan healers and psychological manipulation, but his heart recognized something that transcended ordinary skepticism. The businessman who had built an empire on calculated risks found himself completely unable to calculate the odds of what he was witnessing. Logic and faith were at war in his chest, neither able to claim victory. The girl's hands hovered inches above Nathan's legs, never actually making physical contact, but somehow creating a connection that seemed to pulse with invisible energy. The air around them began to shimmer slightly, as if heat waves were rising from summer pavement, though the restaurant's temperature remained constant. Several witnesses later described feeling a subtle vibration, like the lowest note of a church organ played just below the threshold of hearing. The atmosphere itself seemed to thicken, becoming charged with potential that made everyone's skin tingle with anticipation. Even hardened skeptics found themselves leaning forward, unable to look away from what was unfolding. Nathan's eyes fluttered closed as instructed, his face taking on an expression of serene concentration that transformed his usual worried features into something approaching peace. Michael watched his son's breathing slow and deepen, as if the boy was entering a meditative state he had never experienced before. Color began to return to Nathan's pale cheeks, a healthy flush that hadn't been present for 3 long years. The change was subtle. At first, barely noticeable except to a father who had memorized every detail of his child's face during countless hours of bedside vigil. But it was real, undeniable, and growing stronger with each passing moment. The girl's voice rose slightly, though she seemed to be speaking more to herself than to anyone else in the restaurant. What was broken can be made whole. What was lost can be found. What was impossible becomes inevitable. Her words carried the cadence of ancient prayers or incantations, though she spoke in plain English that everyone could understand. The phrases seemed to hang in the air like visible things, creating patterns of meaning that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to something deeper in the human spirit. Several people in the restaurant found tears streaming down their faces without understanding why. Then, without warning or fanfare, Nathan's legs began to twitch. The movement was so slight that Michael initially thought he had imagined it, his desperate hope creating phantom sensations where none existed. But the twitching continued, growing stronger and more pronounced with each passing second. The atrophied muscles that had remained motionless for 3 years suddenly showed signs of life, subtle contractions that sent shockwaves of possibility through everyone watching. Nathan's eyes snapped open, wide with wonder and disbelief as he stared down at his own body betraying the limits that had defined his existence. "I can feel them," Nathan whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "I can actually feel my legs." The words hung in the air like a revelation, transforming the restaurant from a place of business into something approaching a cathedral. Michael felt his own legs go weak with shock, his hands gripping the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The impossible was happening right before his eyes, yet his mind struggled to process what it was witnessing. 3 years of medical certainty were crumbling in real time, replaced by something that defied every law of physics and biology he understood. The girl remained perfectly calm throughout Nathan's amazement, as if she had never doubted this outcome for even a moment. Her expression held the satisfied peace of someone who had completed a task they were born to fulfill. She rose gracefully from her kneeling position, her movements fluid and unhurried despite the miracle she had just facilitated. The shimmer in the air began to fade, and the charged atmosphere slowly returned to normal, leaving everyone with the sense that they had witnessed something that would change their understanding of the world forever. But the changes in Nathan continued to accelerate, movement spreading through his legs like life returning to Winterdead branches. Michael watched in stunned silence as his son's feet began to press against the wheelchair's footrests with increasing force. Nathan's face was a study in concentration and wonder, as if he was relearning sensations he had forgotten existed. The color in his cheeks continued to deepen, and his breathing became stronger and more confident with each passing moment. The transformation was undeniable, unstoppable, and completely impossible according to everything medical science had taught them. Yet it was happening anyway, right there in front of dozens of witnesses who would carry this story with them for the rest of their lives. The restaurant remained frozen in absolute silence, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about and debated for decades to come. Cell phones continued to record, but their owners seemed to have forgotten they were holding them, too mesmerized by the unfolding miracle to remember the technology in their hands. This was the moment when the impossible became undeniable, when faith triumphed over reason, and when a small girl's simple request for food changed everything anyone thought they knew about the limits of reality. Nathan's hands moved to the wheelchair's armrests with trembling determination, his knuckles white from the effort of supporting weight his legs hadn't carried in 3 years. The entire restaurant watched in breathless silence as the 12-year-old boy who had been condemned to a lifetime of paralysis began the impossible journey from sitting to standing. His face contorted with concentration and effort, sweat beading on his forehead as muscles that had been dormant suddenly remembered their purpose. The girl stepped back slightly, giving him space but remaining close enough that her presence provided silent encouragement. Her expression held the quiet pride of someone who had never doubted this moment would come. Michael found himself rising from his own chair without conscious decision, his body moving automatically as his son performed what every doctor had declared impossible. Tears streamed down his face unchecked, years of suppressed grief and desperate hope finally finding release in this moment of unprecedented joy. His hands reached toward Nathan, instinctively ready to catch him if he fell, but something in his son's determined expression told him that catching wouldn't be necessary. The boy who had accepted his limitations with heartbreaking grace was now refusing to accept them any longer, fueled by strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical form. The wheelchair creaked in protest as Nathan pushed himself upward, his legs shaking with the effort of supporting his full weight for the first time since the accident. But they held. Against all medical knowledge, against 3 years of expert opinions and resigned acceptance, his legs held firm beneath him. The sound of his feet touching the restaurant's marble floor echoed like thunder in the supernatural silence, each step a declaration that miracles were not just possible but happening right here, right now. Several witnesses later swore they heard celestial music in that moment, though others insisted it was just the sound of their own hearts beating in perfect synchronization. Nathan took his first independent step in 3 years, then another, his gait unsteady but growing stronger with each movement. His face transformed from concentration to wonder to pure, unbridled joy as he realized that his legs were not just moving but actually supporting him. The atrophied muscles that should have required months of rehabilitation were somehow functioning with increasing confidence, as if 3 years of paralysis had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The boy who had watched other children play from the confines of his wheelchair was now walking toward his father with tears of happiness streaming down his young cheeks. "Dad!" Nathan cried out, his voice breaking with emotion as he stumbled forward into Michael's arms. The collision nearly knocked the billionaire backward, but he held firm, wrapping his son in an embrace that 3 years of wheelchair-bound hugs had made him think he might never experience again. The weight of Nathan's body against his chest, supported by the boy's own legs, felt like the answer to every prayer he had whispered in hospital corridors and sleepless nights. Father and son clung to each other as if they could somehow make up for 3 years of limited physical contact in a single moment. The restaurant erupted in stunned gasps and scattered applause, though most patrons seemed too shocked to fully process what they had witnessed. Cell phones captured every moment, though their owners knew that no video could truly convey the profound emotional impact of watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. The maitre d' stood frozen with his mouth agape, his years of professional training providing no protocol for handling miraculous healings during the lunch rush. Kitchen staff had emerged entirely from their work areas, drawn by the commotion and staying for the revelation that would change their understanding of what was possible in the world. Michael's business associates sat in stunned silence, their carefully planned meeting forgotten in the face of something that challenged every assumption they held about reality. The pharmaceutical investor who had dismissed the girl's claims with such certainty now stared at Nathan's walking form with an expression of profound confusion, as if his entire understanding of medicine and science had just been upended by an 8-year-old child. Their world of calculated risks and predictable outcomes had been invaded by something that belonged in religious texts rather than corporate boardrooms, and none of them knew how to process the implications. The girl watched the reunion between father and son with quiet satisfaction, her mission apparently complete. She made no attempt to claim credit or draw attention to herself, content to observe the joy she had facilitated. Her small form seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the restaurant's expensive lighting fixtures, and several witnesses later described feeling an overwhelming sense of peace in her presence. She had delivered exactly what she had promised, transforming an impossible situation into undeniable reality through means that no one could explain or understand. Nathan broke away from his father's embrace and turned toward the girl, his face radiant with gratitude and wonder. "How?" he asked simply, his young voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of unanswered questions. "How did you do it?" But the girl simply smiled, her expression holding secrets that seemed too vast for her small frame to contain. "I didn't do anything," she said softly. "I just helped you remember what was always possible." Her words carried implications that would puzzle philosophers and theologians for years to come, but in that moment they felt like the only truth that mattered. The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was as dramatic as the miracle itself. What had begun as a place of casual mockery and dismissive laughter had become something approaching a sacred space, where dozens of people had witnessed the impossible made manifest. Conversations resumed gradually, but they were hushed and reverent, as if normal volume might somehow diminish what had occurred. Several patrons abandoned their meals entirely, too emotionally overwhelmed to continue eating. Others remained seated but made phone calls to loved ones, desperate to share what they had experienced before the memory could fade or be rationalized away. Michael knelt before the girl, his expensive suit forgotten as he brought himself to her eye level with the same respect she had shown his son. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion that no amount of money could buy or business success could provide. "I don't understand how or why, but thank you." The girl nodded gravely, accepting his gratitude with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. Her presence had transformed not just Nathan's physical condition but the hearts of everyone who witnessed her impossible gift, proving that some things in the world were still beyond human control or comprehension. Nathan stood beside his father, his legs steady beneath him as if 3 years of paralysis had never happened. His face glowed with happiness and possibility, the resigned sadness that had characterized his expression since the accident completely erased by this moment of miraculous transformation. The wheelchair sat empty behind them, no longer a necessity, but a reminder of how quickly everything could change when hope met faith and both were willing to believe in the impossible. The boy who had entered the restaurant confined by medical limitations was now free to walk into whatever future awaited him, his father beside him and a miracle-working girl watching over them both with ancient eyes and a timeless smile.